Notice that there's one less person than you may have expected. Ken McDonagh unfortunately had some family issues and couldn't make it across the Atlantic. And so the paper on small states will be online when it's ready, but there won't be a presentation, public presentation of it here today. Instead, or sort of, we've got Jan Volkel, who is here and will be, he's been given dispensation to go a bit longer than his original allotted time. So we'll go from there. We've got two discussants for us this afternoon. We've got on the practitioner, well, on the academic side, Mr. Jeremi or Dr. Jeremi Suri from the LBJ school, from the UT history department, and from lots of other hats, depending on which one he chooses to wear in public. We'll have a great discussion. Yeah, exactly. Which hat is Jeremi going to wear today? And next to him, Rick Froh from NATO, but retired now, our NATO practitioner. So, last piece of logistical information: if you have not signed in, if you are attending for the first time this afternoon, please do so on the sign-up sheets next to the clock, underneath the clock. It is for our records a very important piece of information, so don't leave. You don't have to do it now, but don't leave this room without signing in, or we won't let you back the next time. I'm going to moderate, but no more. All my job will be is to keep time. These guys are going to do their thing, and we'll go from there. Same rules apply as last time. Discussants will discuss. Questions from the discussants to the panelist singular. Questions from the audience. Wrap this thing up at 3:30. So, with no further ado, I turn it to Jan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks to all of you for coming. I really feel honored and to a certain extent also proud to be invited to speak here at the University of Texas at Austin to such a distinguished audience. And I feel honored. At the same time I feel a little bit scared and also a bit afraid, because I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad condition to speak as the first speaker after the lunch break, which is usually something very tricky in terms of awareness raising of people. So I thought I should keep it relatively short and hopefully interesting. Then Michael asked me to speak a little bit longer than planned, because as we just heard, the second speaker unfortunately cannot make it. So I tried to somehow bridge from all the requirements that you gave me.
Very good. I'm sure you'll do fine.
The second reason that I'm scared and honored at the same time are the two discussants we have here. And very happy to have one distinguished academic and one very experienced practitioner here. And we had some small talk already before, and I should say, as a German, I'm very happy that Rick's family name is Froh, because Froh is a very nice German word and it means happy, and I think in these conditions I can work rather well to discuss with you the topic of this afternoon. Something that we have here also in this nice satellite picture of Europe. Of course, the question, what happens here in the region south of Europe? So something that the organizers have nicely hidden behind Turkey. Yes. Turkey as one of maybe the most central or one of the most dominant players in Mediterranean security, and that's probably, beside of course the question what to do with Ukraine, Russia and so on, it's probably the question that is most urgent for European security. So I'm not from Turkey actually, but I traveled Turkey repeatedly with different student groups, also American students, for study trips. I'm based in Cairo, as Michael has just said, since 2 years for the German Academic Exchange Service at Cairo University to discuss Euro-Mediterranean relations with Egyptian students. And that's maybe something that makes me relevant for the topic of Turkey. Last summer I was together with Chantal Lavallee actually 4 weeks in Istanbul as a visiting researcher at Bahçeşehir University. And maybe a second information just on my background is that for the German think tank Bertelsmann Foundation, I'm the regional coordinator for North Africa and the Middle East in the so-called Bertelsmann Transformation Index. You find the website in the short bio in the program. And the BTI, as we call it, is the competitor to the Freedom House Index, which is probably much more famous and more known here in the US, but I can honestly tell you we are much better. So I invite you to visit the website and to explore how we analyze transformation states and how they perform in terms of democracy, market economy, and governmental management. Speaking about the topic Turkey and the European security architecture, I also would like to do this typical triple steps, 3 questions that I would like to discuss with you today. First, I think it's important to speak about the nature of the Turkish state, with a famous and simple question: is Turkey a European country? which is of course a long debate, and I try to reflect a little bit on the history, because Jeremi, one of the discussants, is from the history department, so I hope I do not do too many mistakes with that. So that will be the first question. Is Turkey a European country? If not, what is it instead? Something like this. Second question will be, how did Turkey perform during the Arab Spring that we enthusiastically celebrate in Egypt now, 4 years after the outbreak of the Arab Spring? And analysts from all over the world predicted that Turkey will be a crucial actor in the Arab Spring developments, because Turkey was usually presented as a perfect example that Islam and democracy go well together. And that for Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen and all these revolutionary countries, Turkey would be a perfect ideal, and they should take it as a model to copy what Turkey did. And that is then the second question: how did Turkey perform during the Arab Spring and after? And the final question, bringing this together, is can the European Union and Turkey work well together in terms of security cooperation in the years to come? And I can already say that I'm rather skeptical about the perspectives of this cooperation, and I will explain in the next 15 to 20 minutes to you, hopefully, understandably, how I come to this negative conclusion. First, when we speak about Turkey, is it a European state or not? I think it's very important to consider shortly the history of Turkey. The modern Republic of Turkey was founded in 1923 by the infamous Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who was somehow a revolutionary in himself. Turkey, the modern republic, of course, is the following state of the famous Ottoman Empire, which was founded in the 14th century, and then it grew bigger and bigger and bigger. It was a world empire in the 16th, 17th century, stretching into half of Europe, let's say, stretching almost all the nowadays Middle East and North Africa region. So it was really a world power. But then from, let's say, the 18th century, more and more coming under pressure, the peripheric areas of the Ottoman empires longed for independence, and they somehow split apart. So the Ottoman Empire was degrowing, getting slower, so that in the early 20th century, when it came to the First World War, was very famous in Europe, at least, to say it's the sick man at the Bosphorus. So the Ottoman Empire was somehow, the glorious days were long apart. And the Ottoman Empire had, let's say, one remarkably important characteristics, which is also important until today. The Sultan, which was the political leader of the Ottoman Empire, based in Istanbul, Constantinople at that time, was also having the title of the Caliph. And the Caliph is the religious leader. So it's in the Ottoman Empire we had this political and the religious aspect of power united in one person, in the Caliph. And we can, simplifying, say with the end of the Ottoman Empire, also the Caliphate came to an end, officially in 1924. Anyway, so the Ottoman Sultan was the last caliph we had, combining political and religious authority in his person. And as Atatürk then, who was a leading general in the Ottoman army during the First World War, very famous for his achievements, particularly in the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915 against the British and the Western Allied forces, had to do something. He decided to create a new republic which was fundamentally different from the Ottoman Empire. That is what we then famously call the Kemalism. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Kemalism consists of 5 principles, and one of these principles is the most interesting one: secularism. The strict division of religion and politics, which can be seen as an anti-reaction to what we had in the Ottoman Empire, where both were united. And Atatürk said, in the modern Republic of Turkey, we want to have secularism. Atatürk, and he is famous until today, died 10th November 1938. Every young Turkish person can tell you so, because in schools it's very high on the school agenda. Died in 1938, and then Turkey developed over the decades. The second principle of Kemalism, which is important to understand Turkey nowadays, is the dominant rule of the military. Why? Because Atatürk himself was an important representative of the Ottoman army. He trusted the army very much in terms of stability, and the young Turkish Republic was very much under threat, at least they felt being under threat, from the international post-First World War community. We had the Treaty of Lausanne, the Treaty of Sèvres, and Turkey shrank in its territory as it is today. So Turkey felt oppressed somehow, and Atatürk put a lot of emphasis on the military to guarantee the stability of the modern Republic of Turkey. And these two things, secularism and militarism, or military-backed politics, is very important to understand how Turkey then developed. in the 1980s, 90s, because we could simplify and say until the 1980s not much changed in these basic conditions of Turkey. Of course, there were some reforms, the multi-party system was included, it was a parliamentary democracy to a certain extent, but the military was dominant in politics. This, having said, means that the rise of the Islamist AKP party, the Justice and Development Party, under the now President Erdogan in the early 2000s, he got elected as Prime Minister in 2002, was a fundamental change in Turkey's character. Why? Because for the first time we can really see that the Islamist party, Islamist not to be confused with terrorist or extremist, just a party that says we want to have religious values, not being separated from politics, but included in politics. We want to have Islam as a relevant factor in public life in Turkey. So for the first time since 2002, an Islamist party and Islamist politicians got the majority in the Turkish parliament and accordingly got elected into the office of Prime Minister and running the government since 2002. So what did Erdogan, then the Prime Minister, since last year the President, had to do? He had to do twice. First, he had to he had to collect support from Turks who are really religious and rich. And this is this famous main base of his power, the Anatolian Tigers, as we call them. It's not the bourgeois society in Istanbul, which is sitting there enjoying latte macchiato, cappuccino in fancy cafes along the street and alcohol in the evening. It's more or less the small and medium-sized enterprises in the Turkish mainland, more here in Anatolia, around the capital Ankara, which we can see here, and even eastwards. Because there it's really the potential of Turkish society, people who are deeply religious, and at the same time they are successful businessmen. And Erdogan understood to a certain extent that doing business for these people is of course something very nicely connected in international relations with the countries more southwards, the Arab countries, Middle East and North African countries. Before, Turkey had almost no vivid relations with these countries. Why? Because under this aspect of Kemalism, religious groups, the idea of an Islamic Ummah, the society, the unity of all the Muslims, was very alien to the understanding of Turkish Republic. And Erdogan was the first one who saw there is potential in trade with our southern neighbors. For example, Iraq, after the 2003 Iraq war, Turkey nowadays is one of the biggest investors in the Kurdish territories, Kurdish regional government in the north. If you go there, you will be surprised to see in the shops so many Turkish products. All the construction is more or less done by Turkey. And the same we can see in Libya, for example, before the fall of Gaddafi. Turkey was mainly the main country being active there as an investor and running construction and all these things, which already explains why Turkey was very hesitant in 2011 when it came to the decision whether to interact in Libya militarily against Gaddafi, yes or no, because for Turkey a lot was at stake, losing a lot of investment and 25,000 Turkish workers who were in Libya at that time. So if we say at the beginning of Erdogan's leadership, 2002, we could probably describe Turkey as a country which was still very secular, and second, it was very military backed. And Erdogan succeeded in the first one to bring Islam into public life and also to make it attractive for a majority of Turks, or at least a big portion of the Turkish society. And he was also successful in the second condition that he had to change for his favor, namely to reduce the influence of the military into daily politics. And that was something where Turkey's Islamist government and the EU went very well in line. Because of course, Turkey got accepted as official candidate country for EU accession in 1999, 3 years before Erdogan became the Prime Minister. And you can imagine that one of the prime conditions for an accession country joining the EU is that the military is under political control and not the other way around. So from this perspective, Erdogan had all the backing from the European Union to restrict the influence and the power of the military, and he successfully did that. Not always with, let's say, clean hands, so there were some judicial scandals and corruption and so on and so forth, but at the end we can say nowadays the Turkish army indeed has lost its prime position in Turkish politics. And as a Democrat, I like this, of course. because we cannot accept that we have a democratic country where the army, as a veto player, decides over politicians who are elected by a majority of the people. That's not going well together. So when we look into literature about security, everybody quickly comes to the Copenhagen School of Security and this concept of security architecture and regions. And in 1999, Thomas Dietz wrote, based on these considerations of the Copenhagen School, that Turkey would be an insulator state, which means it's a state that does not really belong to one of these security areas. We have Europe there, and we have former Soviet Union there, and we have the Near Middle East there, and Turkey somehow in between. Not belonging to each of them really, but somehow in between and not really relevant for each of them. That was 1999. 2005, Thomas Dietz, the same Thomas Dietz, wrote a remarkable, in my eyes, remarkable article where he said, I was wrong. Turkey is not an insulator state. Turkey is not somewhere outside the European security area. Turkey is part of it. And that's remarkable, first because it's really something if an established scholar admits in a referee journal that I was wrong 6 years ago, that I have to revise my opinion. I think we can learn a lot of that from that. It was also remarkable because indeed Turkey succeeded in its path to reform. Because bringing down the military's dominance was only one of these reforms the Turkish parliament ratified under AKP government. The torture was banned. The death penalty was abolished. Religion got a freer standing. It's difficult to understand in our eyes, ears. Let's say headscarves were banned at public places before, which discriminated all religious women from participating in public life. So if a woman was religious, she was banned from studying at public universities, for example. She was banned from working in public offices. And the AKP government reformed that, allowed the headscarf, not made it mandatory, but allowed a headscarf so that religious young women could go to public universities. And the EU cheered up to that, because it's a good step in the way to say, okay, we cannot discriminate on the base of gender or religion, and removing this ban of headscarves was perceived as a positive step. Which means, during the 1990s, during 2000s, under AKP government, we can see somehow a paradoxic development. Turkey became more European under an Islamist party, which is somehow surprising if you think about it. And at the same time, it became less European, and that is maybe the paradox that Turkey has to suffer from today. If I say it became more European, we could also think about how the Turkish government dealt with the question of the Kurdish minority population in the southeast of the country. So we all know that there's a huge conflict between Turkish military and the PKK, and they somehow struggle about identity and should Kurdistan become independent or not. And until the AKP party, it was purely military question. There's the PKK, that's a terrorist organization, we have to fight them. And we have to abolish their houses, to remove complete villages, and so on and so forth. Under AKP, Erdogan found another tone to say, no, we should somehow recognize that there's a Kurdish culture, we should give them Kurdish self-determination, so that we allow Kurdish language and media, for example, we acknowledge that there's a Kurdish culture, and we do not simply remove it with the argument that's Turkish. So also a thing where we would say that Turkey became more European in terms of protection of minorities, ethnic minorities. And finally, also something important in the 2000s was the relations between Turkey and its direct neighbors, Greece and Syria. In 1999, there was Greece and Syria listed among the national threats for Turkey. So perceived, our neighbors are military threats to the existence of the state. In 2002, both countries were removed from this list. Why? Because again, Erdogan said we have to somehow acknowledge and we have to live with our neighbors, particularly Greece, with historic difficulties from the early days of the Republic of Turkey, but also with Syria, where the young Assad had just taken over the presidency from his father in the year 2000. The father passed away, and the young Bashar al-Assad, who is still the president, took over there. So we had a young leader in Syria, and somehow Erdogan in Ankara, who said we should deal with our Syrian neighbors too, which has a lot to do with internal conflicts in Islam. Namely, Assad is more or less the Shia representative, the Alawis. Meanwhile, Erdogan is strictly Sunni, so that's already something where they find a lot of reason for conflict. So Turkey was on the way to Europeanization, we could say. At the same time, we also recognize that Europe itself, and that's what we discussed this morning, became more European in itself, namely security-wise, The idea of establishing European security and defense policy in 1999, for example, meant that we take power from NATO and give it to the European Union. And that's where the problem in terms of security cooperation begins. In NATO, Turkey is a full member since 1952. In the EU, it's an accession country. And simply this move to say we create something in Europe as a security policy architecture without the obligatory support from NATO meant that Turkey was somehow moved out from the central decision-making process when it came to European security policy. And the second development within the European Union security architecture was briefly mentioned this morning, the dissolution of the Western European Union and the full integration into EU structures. Usually it's said through the Lisbon Treaty. I think legally the Western European Union was dissolved in 2011. However, we don't have it. With the Western European Union, Turkey was an associate member since 1992. And according to the statutes of the Western European Union, this meant that Turkey had massive possibilities to influence decision-making in the Western European Union. Now the Western European Union is dissolved, included completely in the EU security structures, and Turkey is out. So from the Turkish perspective, that's somehow disencouraging. The Turkish government could easily say, we tried to reform, we tried to be more European, but at the same time, the European Union took a distance from us. Plus, of course, many other problems which were there. So, and that is a little bit the dilemma that we faced in late 2010, early 2011, when the Arab Spring broke out, which quickly brings me to my second question, how Turkey performed during the Arab Spring. Namely bad. Which is not only Turkey's fault, but Turkey, Erdogan as prime minister, very ambitious man, saw his chance to say the Arab Spring is the Turkish chance to really become a regional player of relevance, to get into the center of all security concerns in the Euro-Mediterranean area. So what did they do? They started to promote own diplomacy with almost all the countries there, with Libya. Turkey was the maybe loudest critique of NATO involvement in Libya within the NATO framework, which did not make friends here in the US, neither in Brussels, in the NATO headquarters, nor elsewhere. Turkey started as perceived itself as a credible mediator in Syria in the early days of the conflict before the real civil war broke out, because Erdogan felt that he had a good personal relation with Assad. So he thought Turkey could be a mediator there, but it failed because Assad did not accept Erdogan as a mediator. And then Erdogan changed from supporting Assad apparently to completely opposing Assad. And the suspicions, it's very difficult to judge whether that's really true or not, goes as far to say that the Turkish government supports financial-wise and with weapons, even the Islamic State, which is now causing so much trouble and pain in certain territories of Syria. Whether that's true or not, it's very difficult to decide. And of course in Egypt, the country that I have the pleasure to live in, the development itself was not very positive for Turkey. First, we had these elections of the Muslim Brotherhood in parliament, and also as the president, Mohamed Morsi, the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they had a very close relation with Turkey. Turkey increased its foreign aid to Egypt by 10 times, 20 times, tremendously if you look into the data. And Morsi was grateful for that, because at the same time Morsi lost the support from Saudi Arabia, particularly in the United Arab Emirates, so Turkey somehow jumped in as a swing state. But then when the events in Egypt turned into the different direction in June, July 2013, and Mohamed Morsi was ousted and replaced by a military man like President Assisi as we have today, this friendship, of course, completely broke up. And Erdogan was one of the most vocal critics towards what happened in Egypt. And Erdogan, and that's also kind of a dilemma, I would say, he clearly declared that's a coup d'etat. And a coup d'etat is not acceptable. Meanwhile, the European heads of states, they were more hesitant to say, somehow it's the will of the Egyptian people, and we need to see, and whether it's really military coup, it's not really clear. So Erdogan presented himself as the decisive man, and he even said, I'm more democratic than the Europeans, because it's clear that what's going on in Egypt is bad, and we should name it like this. So from that perspective, we can say that Erdogan moved Turkey somehow into the offside. In terms of NATO cooperation, in the question of Libya, also in terms of EU cooperation, question of how to label and how to deal with the events in Egypt, and probably you read it on the news, that Saturday night the Turkish army invaded Syria to rescue 38 or 28 Turkish soldiers from a small Turkish enclave which is there, without the consent of the US, without consent of the NATO partners, without consent of the EU partners, which is somehow an affront, of course, not only towards the Syrian government, but particularly towards its Western allies. So from that perspective, we can say that Turkey tried to be a very active actor in the Arab Spring developments, but at the end it was somehow bad success, because they neither want friends in the Middle East, nor they want friends in Europe, nor in the United States. So somehow Turkey maneuvered itself into kind of offside from all sides. So bringing this together, can European Union security policy architecture work well together with Turkey? I believe no, for the reasons that I just mentioned. Erdogan is now the president of Turkey. As it looks like, he secures his power in a way which we would perceive as absolutely non-European. So the Turkish parliament since a couple of days is discussing, for example, a new internal security law, as they call it, giving wide power to police forces to arrest people in demonstrations for nothing, more or less. Gives power to the governors, to the centrally posted administrators of the Turkish regions to ban demonstrations for nothing at the end. So it looks like that the AKP government in parliament tries now to somehow cement the power of the AKP in a way which is not European at all. So here we should admit that Turkey has left its path of Europeanization and the reforms that we would perceive as positive. That's number one. Number two is, within the European Union, things have also changed. I strongly believe it's valid to say that the accession of Cyprus in May 2004 was a strategic mistake with regard to the relations between the EU and Turkey. Why? Because we have this decade-long hostility between Greece, Cyprus and Turkey. And now Cyprus is in the position, we heard this morning, to block everything within the EU framework. Greece is in the position to block everything within the NATO framework. But even what happened most lately in Greece, that we have a new government in force, this socialist Syriza party, which is very much favoring, as a Greek colleague told me, of having real democratic input into decision-making progress. So the Prime Minister Tsipras apparently strongly believes into asking the people and having feedback from the local people what to do in these times of financial crisis. Erdogan is just the opposite. So with the demonstrations about Gezi Park in 2013, where many Turks demonstrated against this uncontrolled power of the Prime Minister at that time, the government, it's very much which is in conflict with the understanding of the Greek new government. And at the same time, also Cyprus has a new fundamental role to play, because since a couple of years, more and more natural gas has been found in the Mediterranean Sea, so that we have nowadays a strategic alliance coming up between Greece, Cyprus and Israel, which is not historically a good relation. Historically it was a good relation, surprisingly, between Turkey and Israel. But this has somehow changed. So now Turkey believes that they are getting into the geostrategic offside, because we have this alliance through the Mediterranean Sea, Greece, Cyprus and Israel being together. So the Turkish army feels a little bit under pressure from this. And of course Turkey also claims the right to exploit these gas resources, which is connected to this unsolved problem, not to think about northern Cyprus and the question whether it's legitimate Turkish or legitimate Greek. And let me conclude with the final wording on the Ukraine crisis that we also discussed this morning already. I think one of the very few positive effects that we could hopefully expect from the Ukraine crisis is that somehow Turkey indeed gets back into the European security cooperation. Why? Because it's a crisis directly in the neighborhood of Turkey. It's a question where NATO is involved. And it's a question where it's crucial how President Putin is somehow dissed and included in international diplomacy. And here Erdogan maybe sees a chance. He still has good relations with Putin, and maybe that offers the chance that Turkey could perceive itself as somehow sub-negotiator, or at least friendly man towards Russia, because I believe it would be a fundamental mistake to close all the doors for the Russian government. We heard this morning from the Russian ambassador and so So I hope that Turkey can somehow contribute to positive discussions about how to solve the question about Ukraine, which is in its direct neighborhood. I could speak much more. I think I spoke already much too long, and I thank you all for your kind attention and your consideration, and I'm looking forward to Mr. Froh's and also Jeremi Suri's critical comments. Thank you very much.
Very good. So normally, yeah, we're going to start with you, Jeremy, if that's okay,
Okay.
and then we'll move to Rich
Sure.
here at the end. So.
Sure. So first I want to thank Lawrence and Michael for organizing this wonderful conference and for reminding everyone that security issues in Europe matter. And that these are things we should be spending more time on. There's certainly more and more interest among our students in these issues. And so I'm glad that we can also now build on that interest and provide more programming and hopefully more cutting-edge catalytic scholarship, such as the catalytic paper that started us off today. That joke's probably been made too many times already.
Never gets old.
So I really enjoyed this paper by Jan, and I want to just sort of articulate some of the key points I think in the paper, why I think they're important for us, maybe contextualize them a little differently, and then offer my own historical perspective on a few of these points, just for the purposes of discussion. I think the main point that Jan makes, and he articulated this well at the end, is that the EU and Turkey have been drifting apart on security issues. But the irony, of course, is that they've drifted apart in part because they've followed similar paths. That there's been a similar dynamic at work within these societies, and a similar dynamic which he called Europeanization. I'm not sure that's exactly right. We might call it Westernization. But that dynamic has pulled these countries apart, even though they're following the same dynamic. And this is, of course, a very common historical way of thinking about things. This was, of course, Hegel's point, right? That the spirit of history works in similar ways on different societies, producing different outcomes in them. And that's a similar Hegelian argument that's being made here. It has many dimensions to it. I want to read you actually part of the paper, which I think makes this point very well. There's a certain level of irony, as one can understand Turkey's development over the last 13 years as a fast-forward copy of the EU's own development since the end of the Cold War, from an initially mainly military-oriented security concept to a more comprehensive security understanding that favors civilian tools over military deterrence. And what Jan talks about in the paper, which he didn't have time to talk about in his presentation, is of course the Foreign Minister and now Prime Minister's long background in international affairs and his argument for quote-unquote strategic depth for Turkey. And of course, those of us who have followed affairs in the region have seen a neo-Ottomanization of Turkish foreign policy for many years, an effort under Erdogan and Davutoglu. Is that how you pronounce his name? How do you pronounce it?
Ahmetoglu.
Okay, that under his leadership.
The son of Ahmed Tolu.
Okay, I have trouble pronouncing his name.
Davutoglu, Ahmed Davutoglu.
Davutoglu. Under Davutoglu, an effort by Turkey to play what I think we would call in international relations theory a super-regional role. To play more than the role of an insulator state, or even more than the role of an important regional state, but a super-regional role, which is to say a role integrating different regions. Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe, all in different ways, and the Middle East being a significant part of this story. Areas, in other words, that were under Ottoman control historically, that are no longer under Ottoman control because there is no Ottoman Empire, but yet Turkey has a historical claim to, but also an argument about cultural and political influence. And there's been an effort, certainly since Erdogan took power, to play this, what we might call neo-Ottoman game, super-regional strategic depth efforts. And I think the paper brings this out very well. In certain respects, it makes Europe more important to Turkey. In other respects, it makes Europe just one of a number of regions that are important to Turkey. This has mattered domestically because strategic depth has also meant firmer civilian control over Turkish leadership. It's meant the imbrication of Islam as an important part of Turkish authority, Turkish legitimacy, because many of these areas are Islamic areas that it's moving into, but party dominance, not necessarily religious dominance. This is not a story of Iran where the mullahs are actually dominating policy. You have a civilian political leadership claiming Islamic legitimacy for politically expansive policies, and policies that are built upon influence as much as military muscle. Now the paper argues that this development has contributed to distrust and a loss of credibility. Distrust at many levels. One, that Turkey looks in multiple directions, sees itself as advancing but not given fair credence for its advancements in Europe, and Europeans distrusting what Turkey is really after in these regions. Second, there's a loss of credibility because, as the paper outlines, Turks believed they had done the things they should have done for appropriate accession into Europe, and of course that did not follow. And Europeans, seeing in Turkey a growing Islamic influence, seeing therefore less Europeanness in the outward manifestations of authority in Turkey. So a loss of credibility. In a certain way, the Kemalist state, right, was able to make a case to be, shall we say, more credible as a European partner because it seemed, at least superficially, more European, even if below the surface it was less so. So the paper argues that these dynamics are pulling Turkey and the EU apart, and that it's hard to see them coming together in many ways. I'd add a few points, and then I want to offer a different perspective. First, where I'd like to have more discussion would be on what were the actual missed opportunities. Could this have gone a different way? Was this a Hegelian shift, or was there really an opportunity? Maybe before the Cyprus decision in 2004, but even thereafter. Certainly American policymakers believe there was. That doesn't mean American policymakers are correct. But the American position on this is that the Europeans were not open enough in the years after 2004 to Turkey, and could have reached out to Turkey more. It's, again, easy for the United States to make this argument. I'm not saying it's correct. But it's certainly the standard view around Washington that the Europeans, that Brussels dropped the ball on this, and coming in for a lot of blame with the Germans, usually, in this discussion. It's easy to blame the Germans for everything we don't like in Europe, right? So, were there missed opportunities? Are there decisions that could have been made differently? I think that's important for us to look at. If we're going to learn going forward, we need to understand that in a more fine-grained way. Second, I think it's important for us also to spend a little more time really thinking about how much trust and credibility there was before. Has there really been a loss of trust and credibility? Or was there never any there before, but other external, other extraneous, other externality pressures that brought these societies together? For example, were they more likely to work together because you had a more involved United States in Europe? Were they drawn closer together because of dynamics in the Middle East that might have pushed them together, especially in a period when, post-1973, with the influence of Saudi Arabia and other important states in the region? To what extent were there other factors that brought these societies together, and is the loss of distrust or loss of credibility not something new, but actually something that's always been a structural issue? This has long been something that scholars of NATO have debated. People like to go around saying NATO is an alliance of democracies, right? And then they would point to Turkey and say, well, was it really a democracy? Were there really these levels of trust, or was it a common enemy in the Soviet Union and a common set of aid dynamics, military and foreign aid dynamics, that brought these countries together? If we're going to bemoan the loss of trust, we should study whether the trust was there to start with. Now, I think one could argue, in addition to this wonderful paper, that there are pressures bringing the EU and Turkey together. And I just want to spend a little time on those. The paper hints at these, but of course makes a different argument, which is fine. Every good paper should have an argument. But I think one could see it going in the other direction. And I want to just bring up 3 points here very quickly. I want to build on Jan's point about Ukraine. I wonder if what we're watching in Ukraine is actually the reconstruction of a Turkish-EU partnership authored by Vladimir Putin. It seems to me, and the little I've been able to interact with Turkish leaders and Turkish thinkers, it seems that although there might be a still open relationship between Turkish and Russian leadership, Russian expansion in the 21st century, as in the 19th century, is bad for Turkey. It was never good for the Ottomans, and it will never be good for Turkey today. If Putin is committed, as he says, I think quite clearly, to a more assertive role for Russia in its southern near abroad, that infringes deeply upon the influence of Turkey. It has a deep effect upon Islamic peoples in the region, and most significantly, it puts a more threatening enemy at Turkey's border. And so to what extent do the similar concerns about Russian expansion bring together, to put it very starkly, Angela Merkel and Erdogan in ways one would not have expected before? And I would argue as a historian, this is exactly what happened, of course, after World War II. It was Stalinist expansion, the fear of Stalinist expansion, that was instrumental. This is the basic history of the containment doctrine, not only bringing the United States in, but bringing Konrad Adenauer together with the Turkish leadership to see a common Western, as Adenauer called it, response to communist aggression. Are we seeing that again? This is not a new Cold War, but as I like to say to students, the Eastern question of the 19th century in many ways is still alive. This is the Eastern question, it seems to me. Second, I think the Greece issues, the issues in Greece, and our friend Yanis Varoufakis as foreign minister there, a former colleague of ours, I think it's interesting to think about the role of Greece today in this dynamic. Of course, as everyone in this room knows, and many know better than I know, it's hard to imagine the Turks and the Greeks agreeing on very much. But it does seem now they have a common gripe with Germany. That might be actually a reason for them to agree on more than they have before. For the Germans, of course, it's that for the Greeks, excuse me, of course, it's that the Germans and the Bundesbank, now the European Central Bank, are dominating the economic structure and, in a sense, conducting a neo-imperial relationship with the southern part of Europe, exporting heavily there and then accumulating capital from the southern part of Europe. That's at least the argument that the Greeks are making. And of course, the Turkish argument, I think not incorrectly, is that the Germans were instrumental in keeping the Turks out of Europe. That it was in fact German concerns about Islam and German concerns about the economic consequences of bringing Turkey into Europe that were significant. Are we seeing, again in 19th century format, a Southern European, Central Asian concern about too much German power? And is that fundamentally something that might, despite the cultural and historical differences, bring Turkey and Greece together on certain issues? Lest you think this is silly abstract theorizing, that is exactly how NATO worked as well. One of the arguments the United States continuously made to the Greeks and the Turks, as they were both part of NATO, was that, do you really want us out and the Germans to be making the decisions, the security decisions here? Which of course brings us to the third point. What role for the United States? I don't think this conference is or should be about the United States, but I do have to say that so many of the dynamics, so many of the issues that come up in this paper, the United States has a role to play, either as an actor or as a non-actor, but as a role that is significant. If you think about events in Libya, that of course Jan talked about, if you think about the Arab Spring, but most significantly, if one thinks about a future European security architecture, as I'm sure you talked about this morning, it's hard to imagine it without some role for NATO. And the fact that Turkey and Greece are both significant, fundamentally significant to NATO, makes it hard to imagine a European security structure growing without both of them participating in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's fair to say that as we see continual instability, which we're likely to see for coming years, around Ukraine, around the Greek economy, and around Iran as well, we're likely to see more, not less, American interest in bringing the Turks and the Germans and the Greeks together on issues of security. Because if there is anything guiding American policy, it's a desire to contain instability in these regions with fewer American soldiers on the ground. Which means it's only the actors in the region, our allies, who can do the work then. It would be easier for one to see a drifting apart of security between Europe and Turkey if the United States was going to come in and act as the mediator on the ground, but that's not going to happen. So there's going to be much more pressure from Washington for these sides to work together. I'm not saying that'll be effective, but that certainly is a centripetal force, an external force that will be pushing and encouraging them to come together, which is why I think this is probably a golden age for a European security policy. Because in a sense, all of the external enemies and allies want it to succeed. Americans have every reason to want to see European security established, a European security doctrine, and of course greater European contribution is required for every Secretary of Defense to say that on every trip to Europe. Ashton Carter will say that soon. Europeans need to contribute more, play more of an active role. And I think the enemies, in this case the Russians, are making it easier as well. Easier to make that case. What is it that fundamentally brings security alliances together? As a historian, I think there are three conditions, and I'll close on this. One is a common enemy. That's the starting point. It doesn't make it enduring. But a common enemy is the foundation for some sort of common security policy. I'm not talking about social policy here. Second, an external sponsor. That would be the United States in this case. And third, I think fundamentally a set of powerful actors internally who see a value in this. And the more I look at Angela Merkel and François Hollande dealing with Ukraine, it's hard not to think that they don't see more of an incentive of their own. Not for this to be a German or French policy, not even for it to be just a Northern European policy, but for it to be a truly European-wide policy that would include Turkey, even if Turkey is not fully part of Europe in their own eyes. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jan, I'll try to live up to my last name. I very much enjoyed the paper. To me, I've been at NATO 22 years, so I've seen Turkey operating in the NATO forum, often difficulty, and it's, from a Turkish point of view, I think it's in some cases reaction, in other cases it's Turkey provoking. But the relationships from my time, and when I first got there, sitting in the NATO Military Committee in the early 90s, and listening to the discussion as the former Yugoslavia broke up, and Macedonia, and hours and hours and hours listening to discussions about what do you call that piece of territory. And now we have the famous footnote, Turkey recognizes the Republic of Macedonia by its constitutional name, forever burned in my brain. That and the Aegean. One of the things I did, I think in the first year, was go on the military committee tour, and we did Turkey, Greece, and Italy. And time spent, my boss, Field Marshal Vincent, chairman of the military committee, talking to shuttle diplomacy between the Turkish chief of defense and the Greek chief of defense to try to solve issues regarding air defense in the Aegean. It's still there. Questions about how do they, two allies, but not quite trusting each other. And I think one of the organizational pieces is the fact that both of them are in NATO means that at least they're talking, and that's been a good thing. The question on Turkey in the EU, I think for different reasons, it was a fairly easy decision, I think in 1952, to decide to bring Greece and Turkey both into NATO. I think later, particularly after the Cold War, and the push for first Turkey's interest, and then the EU's decision to start the process. In hindsight, I'm not sure, and one of my points would be, don't promise what you don't intend to deliver. Because I think that was probably the start. If you're not going to go down that road, and I'm not sure that Germany and France in particular, but maybe some others, were really prepared to go to the end of that journey. In which case, why start down the road? Because now, unless you're thinking, okay, we'll solve that later on, things will be different. I'm not sure how we're going to get there, but magically there'll be a solution at the end. The Turkish concerns, and there's a whole series of, again, things that have happened to Turkey. They've made a lot of the changes that I think were asked for. Whether they would have done that on their own is questionable. Certainly my experience was that the Turkish military, a very different role, and just a little vignette. When we have defense ministerial meetings, often the chiefs of defense staff will be sitting behind their defense minister. In the case of Turkey, that never happened, because the defense minister was junior to the chief of defense staff. That's all changed now, but 20 years ago that was the case. So I think they've now got things in order. But some of their other concerns that they had, you talk about the Western European Union and how that's changed. There's another organization you may want to consider, and certainly when I listen to Turks, it's as big a problem, is the Western European Armaments Group, the WEAG. Okay, they were full members of that. In the European Union, there's a procurement organization called OCCAR. Okay, the Turks are not part of that, but they are fully in the A400M, Airbus military transport. Turkey is buying a whole number of those, so they're fully in that and they pay. They're just not allowed to be in the decision making of OCCAR. In WEAG they were, and one of the deals they had to agree to shutting down WEAG and turning it into the European Defence Agency And one of it was that they would then be given the opportunity to join the European Defence Agency. It hasn't happened. There were two non-EU states that were in the same situation, Norway and Turkey. Turkey is now a full associate member of the EDA. They're in all the meetings. Turkey is kept out. That's one of the real concerns that the Turks have. If that could be solved, and I know a couple of NATO Secretaries General have made that point, that if the EU could agree to that, that would be going some way to open up the Turkish. The other concern they have is operational. And in NATO, we've come a long way in our employment of operational partners in our operations. Initially, when we started in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we had some operational partners, but they were adjuncts. We didn't bring them into the decision-making at all. It was basically, there's the operational plan, you want to contribute, good, you go do that. And we didn't let them in. That has changed, particularly when we went to Afghanistan. And the Australians were probably the biggest pushers for that, saying they're putting the lives of the women, young women and men at risk in Afghanistan, and therefore they wanted to have a say. And the defense minister made very, very clear, that's it, unless we have a say. So we've changed our decision shaping. The Operational Policy Committee that I chaired, we bring in the partners. We do all our meetings with the partners that are involved in a particular operation, and they have a say in the shaping. They don't, the decision is done by allies. Partners are asked to associate. We have a political military framework, 3 steps we have to go through. Turkey looks at that and how that's changed, that they've agreed to. There is nothing similar on the EU side. And Turkey is very involved in EU operations, and yet has no say in the decision making. Maybe you want to come in a little bit later on how that dynamic, if you could. So those are the pieces from Turkey. Turkey has been very strong, in my experience, in protecting NATO's prerogatives. When we talked about Libya and the end of the Libya operation, made very clear that NATO and the United Nations in that case are independent organizations. It's a comment I thought Bernd was going to use. He and I talked about it. Everybody believes in coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. So each of the international organizations has its own mandate, its own area that they feel responsible for, and therefore they don't want to be told by anybody. There's not a hierarchy. Even the United Nations, which is everybody, cannot tell. Security Council can provide a mandate, a legal mandate, but even with that, the international, certainly NATO, would not want to be told what it can and can't do. The nations will decide what it is they want to do. So Turkey has been very strong in protecting NATO's prerogatives. Turkey's involvement in NATO. Right now, our senior civilian representative in Afghanistan, and our first senior civilian representative, Turks. Turkey's very involved in Afghanistan. Areas like aviation sector transition and construction, rebuilding. In Kosovo, they're very involved and very close to the Kosovo government. And in Africa, I spent a lot of my previous job, I went representing NATO in the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. And the Turks are very, very involved in Africa, particularly in Somalia, but along the northern part of Africa. Now, one of the steps, and it's just a more general piece, is a lot of nations use the NATO as the first step and then eventually join the European Union. That's happening with a lot of the Eastern European nations. There are a few, and Serbia will be one of the examples, that will go through the EU track and then perhaps at some point along in the future join NATO. And then there are a number of EU nations that if they wanted tomorrow to join, Sweden and Finland in particular, it would be no problem them joining. And in effect, they're often larger contributors to security than some NATO members. I think that's, Jan, on the paper, I thought it was very, very good. I think there's perhaps to tie it into the broader paper, the so what question. How does that tie into the point as the EU as a catalyst? Just from my experience, listening to Turkish ambassadors, Turkish ministers, I think EU as a catalyst would be a hard sell for the Turks. So therefore that would have to be taken into account. If that idea of EU as a catalyst, how would that play in, and maybe some mention to have your paper then tie in. The other paper that's not presented, which hopefully will play a big part in it, is the other small states and how do they contribute to security in Europe. Each of them is small. They all realize that their security really does rely on the security, the collective security. That's why they were quite keen on joining NATO. That's why right now they're very worried and they want to be reassured. A readiness action plan is one of the reactions to that. But how to convince them, one, to spend more money. Now some of them have done a good job getting their defense spending back up to the 2% level. A number of others don't because they're having economic problems. Even some of the nations that have good GDPs, but how do they contribute to make a worthwhile contribution to security? EU, the broader security, I think there's a lot of things they can do besides defense. I think a third part, and it's not in the paper, and there doesn't seem to be a paper on, other states that have an influence on European security. We like to say, as a Canadian, we have 100,000 ambassadors from Canada in Europe. It's the 100,000 Canadians that were killed in World War I and World War II. Okay. Canadians have an interest in Europe. The United States has an interest in Europe. There are others. Norway is not part of the EU, but they're part of Europe, and in some cases they follow more of the EU rules than some of the EU members. The Balkans that are not yet part of the EU, they're on the membership part. How, looking ahead, how do we want them to contribute to European security? Switzerland, which is an interesting example. We've got them in, certainly our Kosovo operation. They used to be in Afghanistan. Very independent. Remember, they didn't join the United Nations until not that long ago. Yet they realize, and my Swiss friends that I talk to, they're very active in Brussels of making sure security issues are brought up and made clear the Swiss interests in those. So I think you don't have a paper on it yet, but maybe in the cover paper, at least some mention of others other than EU member states, other European states, and then particularly North Americans who have an interest in and have had for historical times. But let me stop there.
Very good. Thank you both for the great comments. Thank you, Jan, for the paper. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Jan will give him a chance to respond both to Jeremy and to Rick there, but also questions. We'll start chair's prerogative, recognizing the co-chair back there, and then we'll go around this direction.
I have a very quick question. You talked about this idea of how Turkey's role has been viewed differently and how that has evolved, and you mentioned this idea of the insulator state, right? And how he said that this is the role that it was playing, and then basically came back and said, "Never mind, I was wrong." Do you think he's going to come back and say, "Never mind, I was right after all"? Because it seems like from what you were describing, and this is why this is actually a question rather than a comment. The way Europe sees Turkey right now, being in the region, I wouldn't say anybody in Europe says that Turkey itself is a security threat, right? But it's also clearly not seen as this reliable security partner, right? So essentially it is an insulator state again, right? Or am I misunderstanding the concept of insulator state, in which case please enlighten me, because it just sounds like that's what's going on.
We'll collect that one. We'll get two more, and then we'll let Jan. So Bert, and then Bert first, and then Sven. Sorry, Sven.
There's a comment and a question also, because Rick solicited my input, if you want.
Yeah.
Of course, you can argue that once the Western European Union was dissolved, when Turkey was an associate member, objectively they lost out a means of feeding into the EU's system. And what happened in the meantime was the accession of Cyprus. Now, we are we are at the EU a club of 28 member states, and we have one state, Turkey, that wants to join the club and says, but I don't want to speak to one of your members. I don't in fact recognize one of your members as a state. So I think, fundamentally underlying the whole issue, and this then feeds into the NATO relationship, is that element. We have given, when the EU was dissolved, etc., we did negotiate some specific arrangements, treating Turkey what is called a non-EU European ally, privileged access to EU operations, etc. And Turkey does participate, but I agree that the situation is not optimal. We have tried to make progress on the whole sort of dialogue track, EU-NATO, as a way towards solving the bilateral secrets issue, but I think Turkey has been very clear that first it's the bilateral issue and then the rest will follow. But on the positive side, they do participate in our operations. We do reach out. We have now, for the first time, we're trying to speak more again to the defense side of the house, which has been difficult to penetrate up to now. So we just keep trying to engage in a dialogue within the limits that exist. Then my question, the missile defense decision. Turks are buying Chinese equipment. Jan, how do you explain that? Why are they not integrating into NATO system? And how do people in NATO look at this? This is a very strange decision from an alliance point of view.
So hold on to that one. Now Sven, please.
I just want to say something about the Western European Union and Turkey's associate membership of that. Because my feeling is that they sort of look at that with hindsight through very rosy glasses, but that they glorify it a little bit. Because let's not forget that in the period in which Turkey was an associate member, the WU didn't actually do very much, right? The only time that the mechanism was used, that the EU could avail itself of the WU, was for a small police operation in Mostar, and that's it. So I gave Turkey all these great rights to participate in nothing very much in reality. Not to belittle the WU, because I think it was important, because it's it's a prehistory of what became ESDP and CSDP, but should not exaggerate the role they play. And even this, I have more from your Kulmon, for example. At the time, Turkey was not that happy with its status, because it felt that it should have more rights within the Western European Union. But of course now they compare with that, and they put it forward as an example that at the time they were actually dissatisfied with it. I went, by the way, just as an anecdote, to the funeral of the WU, because it happens so rarely that we kill off an international organization, right? So I went to the very last session of the WEU assembly, which ended with a ceremony under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and they blocked the traffic, and there was a military band, and we all walked under the Arc de Triomphe. The military governor of Paris was there, a 5-star general, so a 4-star in the rest of the world. French add 1 star always to all their ranks. And he drew his sword. And I thought he was going to run through the last president of the assembly to be symbolically interred next to the unknown soldier there. And since this was a conservative MP, I thought, why not? But it was just to kindle the flame, and that was the end of the Western European Union. May it rest in peace.
What year was that again?
Ooh, this was
97, 90?
No, it's quite recent. 2011, the last
Oh,
session.
that-
The assembly tried to keep itself alive, and it kept advising
Right.
the council for 10 years after the last council meeting.
What did they do in that period?
They still had an assembly which
Yeah.
met, etc., and which really kept itself alive. There was a small secretariat that did nothing but lay booby traps for when we would definitely close it. I negotiated the decision on closure, and then the whole toughest thing I ever did.
Okay, very good. Well, on that note, then we'll let Jan reply and respond, and then we'll take a new round of questions.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you and all of you, and I'm impressed, of course, by your knowledge and your experience. And now I'm, of course, somehow tempted to ask whether you took some selfies from this that you can find on Facebook or somewhere online. I do not want to speak again too long, but let me respond to some of your very valid points. Is it wrong to assume that the Erdogan government is happy about joining EU military missions for two reasons? First, Erdogan wants to please the EU. Second, Erdogan wants to have his own army busy. Because I think that's not necessarily a contradiction. To join EU missions without having a real stake in the negotiations. For Erdogan, it seems, that's my suspicion, I don't have empiric proof for that. That's a very comfortable position. He sends all his generals outside the country, and they are somehow in Afghanistan and in Kosovo and somewhere, so they are busy, and at the same time he is pleasing the EU, and at home he has free hand to steer his policies. Could be. That's just my suspicious answer to those parts. And correct me if I'm wrong, Turkey has the second biggest army in NATO, right? So these guys need something to do, and I think there the EU as well as UN is a very welcomed forum to show Turkey's commitment, and yes, we are good partners and reliable. And it's not only the case that Turkey pays the bill for the others, but the AKP government benefits. Then I'm very grateful for Jeremi's hint with the Hegelian argument, because I think it increases the chance for publication tremendously if you have Foucault, Bourdieu or Hegel somewhere in the introduction. And this was so far missing in my
But we can get the other two in also.
Yeah, I guess so. So I think that's a very valid point that I should include somehow to drop this name again, at least, even though I never really understood Hegel, but I'm most grateful I will look it up and include it.
No one understands.
Yeah. Let me quickly go through, before I come to the questions from the audience. The US perspective on Turkey. It's true, of course. I think there's an important difference between how the US during the 1990s, 2000s perceived Turkey, and particularly the place within European cooperation for Turkey, and the EU perceived it. And I think it's understandable and easy to explain. For the US, Turkey was mainly relevant in terms of security. For the EU, Turkey was relevant more this comprehensive perspective. Yeah? If it wants to join us, it must make reforms, and Turkey was in a very urgent state to make reforms. So I think there are indeed different perspectives. And in Germany, as we are usually blamed for all the bad, as I learned again today, we had a very vivid discussion because, let's say, in 1998 we have also governmental change in Germany from Helmut Kohl's conservative government, CDU-dominated government, FDP liberals, to the Red Greens and Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and the picture changed. So the Social Democratic Green government was much more open towards Turkey. And one of my professors, he was one of the chief advisors within this Christian Democratic Union's decision-making committees and so on. And he always said, even though he was a very strict conservative man, he told me, Jan, I never understood how we can offer Turkey privileged partnership. Because what does it mean? It means that Turkey gets all the benefits, but we don't have any control. It would be much smarter to include Turkey into the EU, because then we can not only give the carrots, we can also use the sticks. That was his perspective, but within the CDU, which framed this term of privileged partnership for Turkey, that was the minority perspective. And the majority said, well, it's a Muslim country, it's a non-democratic country, and so on and so forth, so we cannot offer them full membership. Fundamentally not. And of course, I think you mentioned it also, no, Rick mentioned it, don't promise something that you cannot deliver. I think that's of course one of the core mistakes that have happened. But at the same time, how could you, given the history of Turkish-European relations, with the Ankara Agreement 1963, where the European Economic Community already offered the chance for membership of Turkey in the EEC, it's very hard then to say, by the way, let us be frank, we stop it. So I think it's path dependency somehow, yeah, we are somewhere in the trap, and of course, if Turkey reforms, membership is possible. Yeah? Plus, of course, the argument, in contrast to Morocco, which applied for EEC membership in '87, where it was quite clear to say Morocco is not Europe geographically. This part here, which is Turkish Republic, yeah, it's only 5% of the Turkish mainland, which is usually then perceived as being Asian, but it's bigger than Luxembourg, for example. So we cannot simply say, even for geographic reasons, we kick Turkey out, because they would easily say, yeah, but we have a lot of territory in the European mainland. And these are probably the problems that never led to this fundamental change to say, okay, we forget about it, we speak about cooperation and non-EU European benefits or something, but we close the door for membership, definitely. I think that is path dependent to explain. Whether Greece and Turkey might join because Angela Merkel is such a witch? Could be, but I don't believe it. I think the Greek government is not free enough, independent enough to really go as it wants. So at the end, I hope that within the EU framework, somehow compromises can be found, and that Greece stays in the boat of the European Union. And so, thank you very much, Rick, for your comment with the Western European armaments group. That's indeed a very useful hint, and I will look it up for sure and strengthen this argument that Turkey maybe feels somehow pushed outside. And that, of course, goes back to Sven. Comment that the Western European Union indeed was not effective at all at that time, which is probably true, but I think we have the same position to say from today's perspective, Turkey perceives as somehow discriminated from the European decision makers, because even if nothing had been done in that time, still it was somehow we belonged to it. And finally, I think maybe it's an emotional argument to say Javier Solana was not only the High Representative of the EU, but also the Secretary General of the Western European Union. So from that perspective, the guy who was in Congo and in the Western Balkans active also at least partly represented Turkish power, and that is maybe indeed a valid argument. Maybe I forgot, or for sure I forgot things, but to Lauren's question about the insulator state, that's the same I asked myself when I was reading Thomas Dietz' article. The first was 1999, no, Turkey is an insulator state, outside. The second was 2005, Turkey is part of the European security area, and I wondered myself if he would publish again an article saying, I was wrong again. I believe he would do so. And he was smart enough in his 2005 article not only to say Turkey should be considered as a part of the European security area, unless it starts a different path of development, let me say. Something like this. Keeping this back door open, because of course 2005 we were far from being clear that Turkey has already reached the target. But 2005, I guess he wrote the article, 2004 was of course the time where the negotiations were about to start, 3rd of October 2005, and where optimism was very high. And the Greek question, Cyprus question, I would, if you have more insights about that, I would be happy to hear. How can it be that in 2003 the Greek Cypriots refused the Annan Plan? The Turk Cypriots accept the Annan Plan to overcome the partition of Cyprus, so that the Greek Cypriots are the bad guys in the game, and nevertheless Cyprus gets the membership 1 year later in the EU framework. That's somehow, I simply don't know how these negotiations were done in the...
That was very simple, Jan. That was the condition for Greece for allowing in all the Central East European states. It was a mega deal.
So it was blackmailing from the Greek government.
They called it blackmail. They made a deal.
Yeah, Chinese weapons in the missile defense decision. That's something where Rick has the real insight. I believe it's Erdogan's strategies with a strategic depth. Thank you for stressing on that. So Ahmet Davutoglu's concept.
Yeah.
Zero problems with anybody. Yeah, so that was part of this strategic depth. We deal with everybody, whether it's Western, Northern, Southern, Eastern, good, bad, we don't care, we want to do business. And probably it was that the Chinese offered a good offer for these weapons, and surely it was also a sign towards the Western allied forces to say, yeah, the A400M is a nice plane, but we also know that other countries produce good artillery. So I think that was this again, similar to what we discussed earlier, Putin and Sisi in Egypt now. Is it really friendship, or is it just showing the others that there are more brides in the room than just one? So I think it's maybe the similar.
Just a question, did he have the option of buying American equipment? I don't think so, right? Did he?
Yes.
For the missile defense, he did?
U.S. is actually putting a site.
Right.
The radar site goes into Turkey.
So this is in addition to what the U.S. is putting in?
The U.S. is putting some stuff in, other NATO nations are putting in their systems, so either naval systems or ground-based systems. Europeans have the PAC-3, a number of them have the the U.S. missile that they have, or they've got some capabilities, and particularly radars, and how to bring those all together. What NATO's doing is bringing all the various sensors plus the shooters together, so that you've got a system that can make decisions and knock down a missile that would be coming in. But I'm sure that the sales were there. It's the missile, the European missile, MD8.
SAMT?
Yeah, SAMT is a French one that
It's an outgrowth of ASCII-30.
they're developing it. It's not.
But what are they buying from the Chinese then? I don't understand that.
No, I mean, well, I don't know the details, but I understand that they are buying, I mean, because the missile defense system hasn't been developed in NATO, doesn't cover the whole territory
I see.
of Turkey, no? And so they've been insisting on that it's covered the entire territory, which is impossible up to the States. My understanding is that they're buying Chinese system, and that you will have like a control room where, you know, on that side you will have the NATO guys sitting and on the other side the Chinese system. I just wonder how is that going to work?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, we'll have to continue that particular discussion
Sorry.
because that'll drive us down a lane that we'll end up. So we've got two questions I see left in the audience. We'll start over here and then.
As Dr. Yan has mentioned about the Justice and Development political party in Turkey, which is now on power of the Turkish government and the majority of the parliament, this party has branched in with the same name and similar ideology with a little more extreme in Yemen, Tunisia, Libya, and with another name in Egypt in the early 2012. And then as we see now in the late of 2013, this political system did not work. It was democratically lost in the re-elections in Tunisia, and then in Yemen, and similar to COPE in Egypt and Yemen, and now there's conflicts in Libya. How do you read the Turkish ambitions, or the, let's say, applying the Turkish example in this region, and the loss of this ideology?
Okay.
Well, so I was, and I apologize for arriving late, and if I'm asking a question that's going to waste people's time, but because this is so interesting, I can't resist. So,
Fire away.
And a good lead for the question is the discussion we were just having on missile defenses. I suspect that if you look at the U.S. NATO missile defense architecture, it was clearly designed with the Iranian threat in mind. They explicitly said it was not with the Russian threat in mind because that would overwhelm the system, and designed against rogue launches. I suspect if you look at Turkey's purchases of Chinese missiles defense systems, they are not the configuration that you would expect of a person that's worried about Iran, but probably Turkey sending a message to another power in the Middle East that is not Iran. And you've seen something that worries the United States government, I know, maybe in other administrations more than in this one, but is that the government of Turkey has assumed an orientation that's very ambivalent in the last decade with respect to some vital U.S. interests in the Middle East, especially very ambivalent compared to its orientation of 20 years ago, a very pro-Israel orientation, to give one example. And so, going back to what you were saying earlier, Jan, I think about how you would want to bring Turkey into European Union in order to be able to coordinate better or control better their foreign policy. I don't know if that, I think you were quoting somebody else saying that. And I think this is where I might be a little bit confused, but my question is, what can one do when in negotiating European Union accession, in managing NATO allies, when a country like Turkey suddenly becomes much more ambivalent in the orientation of its government and the orientation of its policy, and starts doing things that a capital like Washington can take as very inimical to vital U.S. interests, such as the Turkish flotilla of 2010, which the U.S. government would have been justified in summoning the Turkish ambassador to explain whether Turkey is now going to undermine the Quartet peace plan process and assist the Palestinians in unilaterally challenging what ought to be final status issues. And so how do you manage policies like that within the context of NATO and European Union.
Just a very quick add-on comment to that, and I think this comes back to enlargement, which I don't want to belabor because it doesn't have that much to do with security, but I think one of the things that you might also want to look at is that I think EU enlargement looks very different post-2005 than it did even 3-4 years before that, because I think the general EU enlargement project was based on this idea that by letting countries in, you're going to solidify and somehow lock in democratic norms, and once these countries were in, you could sort of soften the edges and get them to really westernize once they're in. And once Romania and Bulgaria joined, and you didn't see any progress in corruption, anti-corruption, or in criminal justice reform, or any of these things, and it turned out that the EU was powerless to do anything once these countries were in, I think the whole perspective on what EU enlargement means shifted. And by now, this sort of conventional wisdom is the EU only has leverage until it allows somebody in, and after that, you lose all leverage. And I think you get more and more examples of why that's true today. I mean, Hungary is a good example, right? So I think there's also been a shift in what the EU thinks its own accession policy can do post sort of 2004, 2005. So I think that might have some.
Yeah, thank you very much. I started as a small student, and now I sit here to explain geopolitics in the Middle East and the Mediterranean region. I take your comment as a comment, right? So the changed perspective on enlargement, if I understood you correctly, Lawrence, it's not the healing tool that brings all the problems once a country joins, then it's European and great. No, the problems remain, because as we can see in Bulgaria and Romania, it has not necessarily improved to the extension. Your question, your name was Mark, right? If I remember, Mark, yeah. You said the AKP has been somehow copied by the parliaments 2012 in certain Arab Spring countries, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and so on. And the question was how I read these developments, that they more or less failed, if I understood you correctly. I think we have to say three things. Particularly Egypt, but also Tunisia. Libya probably yes. Yemen I'm not so sure, because I'm not so familiar with this country. After 2011, when the old regimes came down, Ben Ali, Mubarak, Gaddafi, the Islamic groups, not to say parties, had a high level of credibility. Why? Because they were the most oppressed in the former regime. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928, was, let's say, 2/3 of all its time officially banned. Their members in prison or in exile, and that of course gave the representative from these Islamist parties a very high level of credibility. These guys really suffered under the old regimes, so we can trust that they are better. I think that is the starting condition. And in Egypt, for example, it turned into a kind of dilemma, because it seemed to be in Egypt, for the revolution to succeed, we have to elect the Muslim Brotherhood because they are the only credible force besides the old regime. So if I give my vote to one of these new revolutionary groups, my vote is more or less lost, because they will never make a remarkable contribution. So it's better that I give my vote to the Muslim Brotherhood, because I expect them to be the only credible force that could oppose the deep state structures from the former times. Which means, in all these countries that you mentioned, we can assume that many people voted for Islamist parties, not necessarily because they shared 100% the ideological program of the Islamist parties. I think that's number one. And second is, connected with this, for these people in these countries, the disillusionment came very quickly. Yeah. In Egypt, it's quite striking. Within 1 year, the Muslim Brotherhood somehow transformed from a majority-supported party into the outliers. Not completely, because they still have a lot of support, but in the public discourse at least, and in Cairo, in the official discourses that you can hear, the Muslim Brothers are like the devil. They are responsible for all the bad. it's kind of rewriting history which is going on in Egypt. So everything the army, for example, did harmful towards the Egyptian in the revolutionary year is now blamed on the Muslim brothers. So it was not the army that shot demonstrators, it was Muslim brothers in uniform, as you can hear. So that probably explains, because the Muslim brothers and other Islamist parties, of course, they were new to the game. Suddenly they had to run ministries, suddenly they had to run parliamentary groups, working committees, and so on. And none of them, almost none of them, had real experience in how to do it. So they did many mistakes, independent from the ideology. So just technical mistakes. Yeah, and that is what many people really made upset. Plus, of course, and that's my assumption, that people in Egypt, at least in Cairo, it's always difficult because we do not really consider people living in the countryside when we speak about Egypt, but at least in Cairo, 20 million people, or in Alexandria, 7 million people, and so on. As well as in Tunis, the majority of the people does not support the Islamist ideals at all. So when you travel to Tunis, you find many Tunisians who enjoy having their beer after 5 in one of the many cafes in Tunis. They do not want to have an alcohol ban. They do not want to have structural discrimination of women. They do not want to have discrimination of Christian, Jews, or others. What they want to have is normal life, normal business. And these people really got scared when the developments turned as they turned, namely that Morsi not only did technical mistakes, but also did bad policies, with decisions which are not to understand from a non-hardcore Islamist perspective. So I think this comes together, this unexperienced politics plus certain decisions that have been taken that many people said, sorry, that's not in my name. I gave them my vote, but I regret. And that probably explains why these Islamist parties had a very shaky start. And in Tunisia, I would not share your impression that they more or less failed. Ennahda is the junior partner in the new government now. So we have Nida Tunis, which is more or less the secular party being the dominant party, but Ennahda is the coalition partner. So I would not say that this fails, but this probably shows how an Islamist party in the Arab countries should have its position, namely as a valid political opinion with certain influence, but probably not the 50% plus one majority party. And that's final word on that. That's probably the most important difference between Egypt and Tunisia. In Tunisia, it was always coalition governments. In Egypt, it was Muslim Brotherhood, okay, with An-Nur party, but it was more or less the same, running the show, and Morsi did not need to make any compromises like the prime ministers in Tunisia had to do. So I think that's one of the big differences. And finally, the question for the flotilla incident, 2010, this infamous incident where the Israeli army brought up a Turkish NGO boat, or how we call it, with activists who wanted to support people in Gaza, and I think 14 people had been killed by this incident, and that played very well in the hand of Erdogan. Because until today you find this, and in summer there was kind of, the organization that was behind this boat is the IHH, which is kind of civil society group in Turkey that tries to support poor people in the world, so it's a charity organization. Erdogan, from the beginning of his tenure, blamed Israel more than all Turkish governments before. Why? Because the good relations that Turkey had with Israel, particularly in the 1990s, were mainly based on the military. The Turkish army had the interest in having good relations with Israel. They did joint military operations and exercises and what have you. Erdogan, as a civilian politician, with a clear intention to reduce the influence of the military, played this card first to increase his support among those people who perceive the politics of Israel wrong, settlements, suppression of Palestinians and so on. And second, to push back the military from the decisive tools, because cutting the good relations with Israel was a fundamental step in reducing the military's influence on foreign policy. And I think in front of this background, we can better understand how this goes together. This flotilla incident 2010, which opened the door for Erdogan easily to blame Sharon or Netanyahu, who was at this time prime minister in Israel, for oppressing and being inhuman and non-democratic at all, and somehow a state of criminals, whatever his words were, played very well into this hand. He's increased support from the anti-Israeli people in Turkey and around, and at the same time he further reduced the military's influence, because he could easily say the Israelis do not want to cooperate with them at all. And it's obvious why, because they kill our people who just want to support the Gazan people and do good work. I think that goes into this implementation.
Right, but my question is more from Washington's point of view, leaving aside the merits of the Israeli policy and whether it's right to challenge it or not. From Washington's point of view, Washington has a vital interest in the quartet peace process. It would complain if any of its allies in NATO did something that was hostile and undermining of the quartet peace process. Turkey's complicity, the Turkish government's complicity in this mission was well known, and the act could easily have been attributed to the Turkish government as an act of war against Israel and as a hostile act against U.S. interests by the U.S. government. And so my question is, without getting into a normative debate about the incident, just a generic incident like that, when a NATO ally does something that is an almost hostile challenge to vital interests of the United States, what is the right use of European Union institutions, of NATO institutions? What's the right diplomatic approach for the U.S. to do with its European partners, and the right response to the Turkish government?
I think it's to argue in this case is a dilemma. It's a trap where we are in, because one could simply say the peace process Israel-Palestine is already dead. Let's take it. The Israelis continue their settlements, the Palestinians getting more and more radical. It's somehow a vicious circle, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So to argue against Erdogan, to say the Israelis are not interested in peace, yeah, it's very difficult to argue in that way, right? So, yeah, just blah blah, but I can just respond to your question. But
It's an old question, though, right? I mean, so this would have been the story of France in the 1960s, right? De Gaulle was pursuing a number of initiatives that ran against vital American interests. They're going to meet with Kosygin, going to meet with Mao. His criticism of the United States in Vietnam, right? So I mean, it's not unique in this situation. That's how alliances work. I mean, the presumption is that the majority of the security interests are aligned, but there always are going to be, especially when you have a multi-nation alliance of this kind. It's almost surprising that there's been less of that around Israeli issues, it seems to me.
Yeah, if I might add, if you look at some of the other issues that have come up, Iran, you do need Turkey. Syrian question, you do need Turkey. The whole Iraq issue was far less prominent then, but you do need Turkey as well. So it's, I mean,
Yeah.
you balance interests, and that defines also the reaction.
That's your part about NATO. Was NATO the right piece? And I just pulled out Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. It says we'll consult if the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. And I don't think the U.S. could say that its political independence, integrity, or security was threatened by what Turkey was done. So therefore NATO probably wasn't the point the U.S. could have called for a consultation among allies in NATO.
And I'm somehow back on track, just two things. First, the Turkish government itself did not really do something. The Turkish government recalled their ambassador from Israel in reaction to the flotilla crisis, Gaza flotilla crisis. So the Turkish government or the Turkish army as such did not do something that somehow threatened Israel or something. It was this boat by activists. The Israeli army brought it up, killed a few people, and then the Turkish government said, we recall our ambassador and we kick out the Israeli ambassador from Ankara. And the second thing is US interest. As we had Obama just the year before, I believe, in Cairo, giving his famous speech towards the Muslim world, after having finished the Bush time here in the US and saying, yeah, we reach out to Muslims and Islam is not fundamentally in conflict with the Western values. And so I think it would be not necessarily in the US interest to side Israelis' position in this dispute 100%. Because across the Muslim world, it was quite clear that Israel is the aggressor, that they killed people in the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah. So from Obama's perspective, it would be rather logic to play a more defense card in this game and to simply let them do and to see what happens.
Just listening to this, not being an expert in Turkey, just to reflect on the thing when you mention the enlargement, for instance. before. What we are talking about is managing a process, which will not most likely lead to enlargement, but we are talking about managing day by day, muddling through, winning time, trying to grasp as many complexities of this discussion as possible. And when we talk about the External Action Service, we're just beginning of a capability building process, because the system doesn't have a multitasking capability yet. We know that Ashton, for instance, she defended herself on Ukraine, that she was not present on Ukraine because she was tied down in the Iran negotiations. So we didn't even have a two-person capability in the system to deal with this. Now we have a signal from President Juncker that we are not intending to take in new members of the Union, which is already making life much more difficult for my Swedish colleague who's the Director General of the new NEAR DG, who has been dealing with Turkey for a number. We just took home our ambassador from Ankara and put him as head of cabinet for Mogherini, because we had appointed a top-level diplomat, the highest rank he has been Director General twice in the European Commission, Stefano Manservisi, but it was not important enough as a post to keep him there. We took him home. So we've had two good people there, Mark Fiorini, and now. So we upgraded the post, but we don't signal to the Turks that we feel that they are important enough to keep the ambassador in place. So we really have a problem of managing the process, I think. And as you know, I think this is what is said, at least in the papers, that Mogherini is now considering a special representative again for the Middle East, but we don't know the mandate of that, and it just shows how dead the process has been, that we haven't had such a representative, I think, after Mark Otte left. So there is enormous capacity building to be made on this side, which I think is a much more actually important deficit than the military. The lack of military capability is a less critical problem than the multitasking political capability of the EU diplomatic service.
Well, as we are...
It
please.
is the biggest delegation. That's just what I want to do.
Yeah, I know.
The biggest delegation we have.
In Ankara,
In Ankara, right? Exactly.
Which is the biggest delegation?
EU delegation.
EU
Ankara.
delegation.
Embassy, if you want, in Ankara,
It's bigger than in Washington, right?
It's the biggest EU embassy.
Bigger than China or Washington.
Have you appointed an ambassador, by the way?
Not when I left.
Okay, yes, as I expected, the Turkey question could occupy us until midnight, and we would, of course, still be here. So, I'm going to exercise again Chair's prerogative and call this particular portion of the conference a rousing success. I want to thank the paper presenter, but also the commentators here and the audience. An excellent discussion all around. Thank you all, those of you who've suffered through from 8 o'clock this morning, well done. Those of you who have popped in and out, thank you again for attending. We need to give the practitioners a break because they roll into another thing at 4 o'clock. B, if you're interested, come back at 5 for a public presentation, again by the practitioners, on the issue. I know, the 4 practitioners. We promised to feed them well, that's all I can give them. For a talk on current challenges in European security. And with that, we are done for now. Thank you all.
Well done. Have a good day.
I'm very pleased, thank you.
Many students who are off in Cairo. Oh, really? I have not actually. I was just never got it. Yes, I was actually sort of.
Thank you for the comments, always.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It was nice to meet you. I hope we'll have a chance to talk some more.